This is Conversations with the Council. I'm Mike Mullins, the chair of the committee, along with Richard Pollack, our senior advisor, Global Affairs to the Council. Today we have yet another fascinating topic, this time on precision medicine. For this discussion, we are joined by Frank Ahedo, the CEO of Further, including a special guest, Dr. Arkanal, the Executive Medical Director for SCRI UK and Clinical Lead for the Hospital Corporation of America International Cancer Service Line. To complete our introduction and to kick off the session, I'll now turn it over to Frank.
Thank you, Michael. So I'll be brief as well. Obviously very excited to participate in this session. Just very few words on Further. Okay, we have a very unique mission, I think, and I think that will become very clear during the conversation today. As an organisation, what we really look to do is to identify I would say niche areas of medicine at the sort of scientific cutting edge. And our mission really is to be able to identify the experts that best represent that and see how we can, as an organization, accelerate the knowledge, the understanding, the application and the access of that cutting edge science to literally the man on the street. And we do that by way of delivering services, sometimes with insurance benefits, and predominantly focused towards the employer community. Okay, and so we're very, very excited that we can play a role in bringing precision medicine closer to the man on the street. And I think particularly excited to have Dr. Arkanal here to be able to give us a good understanding of exactly what precision medicine means and why it's such an important advance in the treatment of cancer. So with that said, I turn over the word to Dr. Arkanal.
Okay,
Excellent.
so thank you, first of all, so much for inviting me to give you really a summary where we stand as the oncology community, as medical oncologist, clinical oncologist, or hematologist in treating patients in the era of precision medicine and their buzzwords like molecular profiling, next generation sequencing and testing, which often is as well perceived by lay people as very expensive and often unnecessary. And I really want to talk you through in these few slides I've prepared to where we are, what I think is important to consider if we offer genetic and molecular profiling to patients. And key is, of course, to do this in a setting where patients are in established pathways, following guidelines. And really, if you take this as a take-home message here at the very beginning, it is about precision medicine in an agreed pathway around the world. So let me start here with molecular profiling in the news. And you can see over the last 10 years that there have been really, whether medical journals or lay press or very focused journals like Forbes or business journals talking about molecular profiling, next generation sequencing. And the really summary here is they all talk about the breakthrough in the journey to be more precise, treating patients better compared to the old paradigm of chemotherapies with targeted drugs. And to target something, we need effectively targets which we often measure through these molecular profiling tests. And this is not only gene alterations in terms of mutations, fusions, or amplification. These are very technical terms, but can do these days with molecular profiling. Let me talk you through. So really the focus is, of course, around the patient, the individual patient benefit, but then also I will briefly touch on the benefits for payers and give you some examples. And then, of course, for what we do as oncologists day-to-day basis as well, the benefits for clinical research, drug development, getting even better new drugs and targeted therapies for patients. And this will really cover not only targeted therapies, you have heard about the very new arrival of immunotherapies. This will also be covered as part of this brief talk. And why is molecular profiling so important? If you look here on the left side, this is the really treatment paradigm, and still some of the NCCN guidelines, for example, for oncology, where effectively traditional chemotherapies target fast-growing tissue, and some patients are lucky and respond. They will have an effect, a positive effect, which often results in benefit and survival outcome. Then there's a vast majority of patients who have no effect, where effectively the cancer is not doing anything, it's just stabilizing. And then there's also a significant number of patients who have adverse effects, not only in terms of outcome and survival, but also in terms of side effects. So one size fits all treatment is historically that what we have done with chemotherapies. And that's on the right side, the kind of innovative way of what we call personalized medicine, effectively understanding tumor biology beyond just looking under the microscope. Is it a breast cancer? But what does this breast cancer express? Certain gene signatures, and then offering patients the right treatment to target these gene alterations. And ideally, what you want is not only a clinical positive outcome in terms of response and outcome survival, but also a positive effect on potential side effects, which is often very complicated to treat. Patients need to be admitted. And so these are the kind of two extremes. On the left, the old paradigm, which unfortunately is still common practice, but on the right, the new way we developed really over the last 15 years. So effectively, to summarize, is giving the right treatment to the right person at the right time. And again, the timing thing is very relevant, and we'll discuss it later on. Targets can change while patients are treated. Alteration changes, and we need to consider new treatment approaches. So this is a fluid paradigm of personalized medicine, effectively. Why is it so important, and why is what I call NGS profiling? This is often what we call next generation sequencing, without mentioning any specific testing platforms. We can be sometimes very specific on 4 to 5 genes to up to 400 genes. And again, they all play a role to a certain extent in the right hands and in the right environment and using the right pathways. And again, this is something affecting physicians, oncologists in the US, up to Australia, around the world. So this is where we are effectively trying to understand the underlying biology to offer patients precision medicine. And increasingly over the last 5 to 10 years, we also use this next generation sequencing profiling to find patients who have a real chance to benefit of very expensive drugs. Sometimes immunotherapy drugs are usually in the range of $100,000 a year, to really select the right patients to benefit. And again, on the lower bit here on the left and right, effectively are the, what I said before, actionable genomic alterations. These are the so-called genetic targets we can target with these new drugs. Then on the right lower side, MSI and TMB, these are abbreviations for microsatellite instability and tumor mutational burden. Again, markers of potential response to immunotherapy. So that's can be established through NGS profiling and really select the right patient for the right treatment. And this
Can I interrupt, Doctor? Hi,
Yeah, sure.
Richard Pollack. We're going to be interrupting you as you. $100,000. Remember, this is a presentation to American Benefits Council and the benefit managers, directors, and employers, really. And so $100,000, people's eyes just opened up and they got a lot more interested in what you're talking about all of a sudden. So does that mean the employer's paying that money? Do you know that answer? Does the insurance company? Maybe it's a question for Frank.
I would refer this to Frank, but I would extend if patient is insured, this would be paid by the insurance, I guess, and that's effectively also depending on the benefit plans that the individual employee has.
Yeah, I think that the simple answer is that there would be two positionings of this type of proposal. One would be a service type proposal where the ability to access the profiling and have access to expertise to interpret the results of the profiling, and then the results of that would sit within someone's existing healthcare plan that may or may not cover that. What we would typically do as an organization is always provide a solution that says, if we open a door, then the idea is that we service that all the way through. So I think the simple answer would be any proposition coming from further would be developed to fully respond financially to all the outcomes that the profiling would propose as potential treatment.
Okay, thank you.
Good. So I'm moving to the next slide. Of course, when we started molecular profiling in a more academic setting where validation was needed and large-scale clinical trials available, there was always a discussion about the cost of genetic testing. We all remind ourselves back onto the 2000s, very early in 2000, when the Hugo project came up with the whole genome, effectively finding out the genetic code of the human. A single gene testing for human would have been in the range of $100 million, and by effectively, this is a technical term, the Moore, and we're effectively now with whole genome sequencing for patients in these last 20 years at the $1,000 price for testing. So effectively, a huge cost effectiveness simply derived through cheaper testing prices, improved technologies over the last 20 years, and high throughput screening. And again, validation as well is significant cost saving, not on the single test alone, but also by selecting the right patient, the right target to the right treatment. Without this trial and error, I give you a treatment like we have done with chemotherapies and what I told you earlier, where we effectively given treatments and knew that a third is responding, a third have stable disease, and a third didn't respond and had lots of side effects. So that's really what next generation sequencing is doing, molecular profiling, helping to select the right patients who has less side effects, but also is benefiting, and there's longevity, good outcome, goes back to work and contributes to the wider good. So that's really really important. And again, there are more than these few examples. I just picked a few just recently. This is not only for solid tumors, also covering hematological cancers like myeloma and others. So certainly a big development over the last 20 years, not only in terms of technology improvement, but also by identifying new targets as well. So on this, again, is the area where then clinical research plays a role, where effectively with these broader gene sequencing platforms, we find new targets in the context of a certain type of disease. Let's say in breast cancer, a patient gets treated with standard of care, patients progress, and we find through next generation sequencing, for example, genetic alterations, which we suddenly can target, and patients are treated with targeted drugs rather than the next, in line chemotherapy, which is often not very effective.
Hello, Dr. Arkinal. This is Mike.
Yes.
Just a quick question too. I was wondering what countries are advancing this type of technology. Where can you get this type of service from? Is it all over the world?
It's certainly all over the world. That is pretty much the kind of in the forefront. Teams in development are, of course, West Coast companies like in around the biotech companies in the US, and then of course for example statewide molecular profiling is offered in France, in the UK through the 100,000 Genome Project, in Australia, in Germany, and so on. So pretty much around the world. The front run in terms of technologies often come through the US, and however we have great initiatives around the world, and pretty much what is the biggest challenge? You will ask me, when we started 20 years ago with these technologies, it was often the spin-off of an academic university set up. They then effectively got some funding and professionalized themselves. And we have effectively, when I started, about 300 to 400 testing companies. They all offer something which the lay person, and I include the oncologist as well, the lay oncologist who's not really trained to understand genetics and genomics and the effects of targeted therapies, really was a wild west of companies offering tests without often validation, with limited patient numbers. So I think that has really, over the last 3 or 4 years, changed it, obviously with regulatory submission to the FDA or the European agencies, or here in the UK, the MHRA. There has been much more order and effectively validation of tests and approval by agencies. So that's effectively what you would expect these days as well from an oncology, from a pathway, adhering team, that they would use tests which are FDA approved in the US and obviously approved by other regulatory agencies as well over time. So that is rather important to mention. What is also important is that we have, when we started many years ago, tested various different companies and their test offering. Again, and we left lots of those on the way simply because they couldn't deliver and couldn't scale up effectively what you want as well, a broad reach around the world of these testing capabilities. So that is really important as well. So there are a few companies around which pretty much providing global NGS support for the oncology community now. Okay, so I will go to the next slide, and we'll talk you through as well the 3 major developments, what is already shown in clinical trials to be the next new, but also often established through clinical research, gets into practice. There are kind of 3 components. It's early detection. So again, for the patients, for example, who are falling into, and it's not patients, these are effectively individuals, could be your employees, fall into high-risk groups. High-risk groups, for example, to develop cancer. Patients who are, for example, heavy smokers, have lifestyle choices and who are a certain risk to develop cancer. So liquid biopsies in this context are very important and are effectively falling into that context of early detection. Then for patients who had cancer and had curative surgery, were treated, had surgery, and were assessed then with liquid biopsy through minimal residual disease. And then when patients are on treatment, this is another a big area right now where big phase 3 studies have been just reported, read out, and we're just waiting for some of the approvals by the FDA, monitoring for tumor response. So effectively, you're on treatment, we can do liquid biopsies, blood tests, for example, and see how the DNA sequence is disappearing from the blood, i.e. effectively showing a response. And often before CT scan, imaging, PET scanners can show that the tumor is coming back, these liquid biopsies, if you look here on the left side, the limit of detection by ctDNA, which is effectively a blood test to detect fragments of DNA and of mutations in the blood, much more sensitive than imaging. So if you ask me, in the next few years, we probably will use these 3 key components: one as early detection, one as assessment of minimal residual disease of the cured patient, and then for disease monitoring with liquid biopsies. In the last 5 years, when I've been heavily involved in some of these kind of comparative studies where we compared liquid biopsies to the standard of care biopsy, it was always a discussion, liquid biopsies, the sensitivities are not as good as tumor biopsies. That really has changed. There are lots of validated studies out there that pretty much patients where we, for example, can't even get biopsies. Think about the lung cancer patients where you can't take biopsies. You take a liquid biopsy, a blood draw, and can establish a genetic signature. So that's really important. Major developments in the next, I would always say in the next 5 minutes, because that's effectively already the big phase 3 studies are coming out. It's just when will the market adapt to these new changes. And again, one of the key things I think is, again, this slide is very busy. I took this from our own pathway within HCA. And I told you before, there are hundreds of testing companies out there, and they all claim they're obviously adhering and having great outcomes. But effectively, what you need to have is an adoption of pathways, of obviously the national or international guidelines, whether it's ASCO, ESMO, NCCN guidelines. But you need to effectively as well include these genetic testing into a pathway which is agreed, followed. You need to have the right experts around the table as well. So we have established here in the UK, pretty much in analogy to our US counterpart in Tennessee in the US, a genomics review board, where effectively high quality specialists sitting around reviewing these testing results and then making the right adjustments and advice to the oncologist in the community. As I said, the community oncologist, the non-academic oncologists may not even have heard about genetic alteration, which are relevant and target. So there's a big, educational approach needed as well. But that's why it's important that these genetic molecular genomic testing is integrated into pathways to reduce cost. Again, one of the biggest challenges we have seen about 10 years ago, when people thought every 5 minutes when a patient progressed on a treatment, they could do another test, which is often not necessarily, although we understood sometimes patients' target can change. The majority of cancers, it's actually not needed, and you don't need to do repeat genomic testing. So sometimes that is a one-off, and that's good enough to test. So that's why these pathway adherence and in our case, molecular tumor board, a genomics report is absolutely important.
Okay, let's pause for a second, and Frank and Doctor, how does this affect employers? It's a great and very important information, but how does it affect employers, and how can employers benefit from this with their employees?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I think the first thing, and I think in the time that Dr. Arcanow has been discussing this, people may be sitting there thinking there's these pockets, of expertise that exist. And I think that was explained very well. I think how employers can benefit from this is that we now fortunately live in a world where an employer who may have employees around the world, maybe in 20 countries, maybe in 40, that what we're discussing here, the access to this niche expertise that may sit in London, that it may sit in the US, may sit in Germany, etc. That's something that we can structure and we can provide access regardless of whether where that individual employee sits. Okay, so being able to collect the necessary tissue sample or liquid biopsy, being able to make sure it's being tested at a clinic that meets the regulatory requirements and expertise, and then being able to deliver that to individuals like Dr. Arcanow, who are at the top of the that sort of scientific tree, to be able to give the interpretation and feed that back down the path, regardless of geography, regardless of language. I think that essentially, I think, plays very well into the ability for an employer to say, no matter where my employee sits, no matter where whether my employee ranks above or below others, they have the ability to provide exactly the same access to this cutting edge science.
And if I may just add one point, we see here certainly in the UK from some of the insurance, global insurance companies as well, and employee groups, simply as well, significant of targets which are tested these days are also effectively offered through clinical trials as well to be tested. So where effectively think about that situation where you have the choice to pay for $100,000 standard of care, or through genetic testing, $100,000 drug, which is part of, a clinical trial where effectively a clinical trial sponsor takes over costs. So effectively, there's a potential, at least what we've seen here in the UK, with some of the insurance companies offer patients access to clinical trials, and effectively not only enhance our knowledge, but also often outcome with these newer drugs we develop. And so that's certainly a big drive from insurance companies we see here in the UK as well.
Okay, so as you take the example of an employer in 40 countries, and some of them are developing countries, for example, maybe even Egypt or Pakistan and so on, and doctors there may not even know this exists, or do they all know that this exists, and how do they get the opportunity? How does that move forward?
Yeah, I think. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, again, through my, day-to-day practice with colleagues in Middle East, for example, or in China or in Pakistan, the doctors are well trained. They know molecular profiling is available. These tests are available per, press a button and the test comes to you into your clinic, to your doctor's office, and you have access. They have obviously certain distribution points where the physical analysis is done, but the then key thing is have the critical review, the context of disease, and where you discuss these cases and then make the right recommendation. So I think that's what we see. I would say pretty much patients I'm seeing here in London, they're coming from all parts of the world, from well-developed countries, countries where systems are not as well developed. And so, yeah, effectively, it is available, these testing.
And I'd just add to that, I think, Richard, that, the obvious question is, how easy is that for an individual sitting in one part of the world to be able to access that expertise? And it plays back once again to, I think, what we bring to the table, which is we accept that it's not always going to be possible to export the expertise of a doctor like Dr. Arkin now to a specialist or a country where maybe they simply don't have the expertise to deliver that. Then we do it the other way around. I think the example of clinical trials, largely sponsored from an economic standpoint by the trial sponsor, identifying where they are, being able to enroll them, helping that individual navigate, and then all the concierge, which is, how do I get there? Can I travel in a company in person? How long am I going to stay there? What are the hotel accommodations nearby? All of that forms part of the packages that we typically structure. Otherwise, what we end up doing is opening a route that we can't actually fulfill. So once again, I think the element of turnkey, to be able to say that if we are providing that expertise, either we can bring that knowledge locally to where that individual is. If that isn't practical, then we will do it the other way, and we'll take that individual to the seat of the knowledge.
No, I was just thinking more from kind of a company side, corporate side, is thinking about any kind of legal constraints or regulations that might be out there that companies need to be aware of. And maybe I'm thinking more about maybe privacy for patients and employees. So I'm just curious if there's anything that companies need to be aware of or concerned with.
I think from a purely business standpoint, that anything that we do in the delivery or the fulfillment of a service or an insurance, then we've been doing this for many, many years now. So we are strong understanding and respect for data protection. That is a legislation that does vary tremendously around the world. I'd probably say that the European Union data protection legislation is probably one of the toughest. And what I mean by that, it's the one that's the hardest when you fall foul of it. So everything that we do is with the necessary consents and with a use of that information specifically for the purpose that is being requested, in this case for testing and for the treatment of the individual.
And just that in the US, obviously you have your HIPAA, which is kind of very equivalent to GDPR. The testing companies with again material transfer from Europe to the US, it's highly effective from a business point of view, and patient protection, data safety. This is worked through now for many years since, obviously the regulators, FDA and so on. This is absolutely important.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay. Did you have any? Did you finish your presentation, Dr. Arkenau?
I finished. I had a few summary slides, but effectively they summarize obviously how important it is. For me, the key thing is having this established network of specialists. Obviously, it's important with the following pathways, avoiding unnecessary testing, and effectively use the right test in the right context. That's really the most important thing. I want to, as I said at the very beginning, if you take this as a take-home message, that is the most important thing.
Sure. Okay. And I think on that point, it's probably worth. I think you referred to this at the start of the presentation, which is there are obviously offers. I think particularly offers around profiling. Sometimes these are done with, let's say, some form of curiosity behind it, sort of, family trees and potentially the sort of more the wellness side of it. I think it's important that both from the quality and specialty of the experts that review the information from the laboratories that are used for the testing, that this is being done, accessing the what we consider to be the very, very best. I think it's extremely important for us in any proposal. Number one, we don't look to bring proposals to the table that are for a few privileged individuals. We are very much of the mindset and of the mission to provide something that is available to the masses. I think that how do we do that? And I think there was a great slide on there that if you think back, is it 15 years ago that it's $100 million to a test? We're now down to 1,000. That's pretty insane sort of drop in the figures, but it's really leveraging market forces, adoptions, a huge investment, I think, from pharmaceutical industry, where we can actually benefit. Employers can benefit from being able to access some of this incredible science with little or no cost in some cases, because of the strong interest in stakeholders that are involved in being able to understand this evolution. And I think that's an incredibly interesting dynamic for an employer when we're thinking about them as a payer.
And just to add, it's if you understand NGS or next generation sequencing as a triage tool for the right treatment, and to effectively get better treatment for the patient, but also avoid unnecessary treatment and toxic treatment. Again, costs we have never really measured in terms of the emission for side effects and unnecessary treatment is really mind-blowing. And if we understand NGS these days as a triage tool, is really important.
And on that point, because I think it's going to be very interesting for listeners, and just to put this into context, I think I have a rough idea of the answer, but to have it more officially from you, Dr. Arkenau, what would you say on average in the normal approach of oncologists when treating patients with cancer? What percentage on average would you actually say are actually using NGS testing to establish that right pathway at the moment?
Well, in the US, it's probably in the range of 20%. In Europe, probably a bit less. But again, there's certain cancers where you have to do it, where it's standard of care, like the big tumor types, lung cancer, colorectal cancer, increasingly breast cancer. So if you just look into the big five, we see from day-to-day data, prostate cancer. You would expect next generation sequencing, being standard in those cases, and also the uptake in those cancers probably 80-90%. I mean that's really the because treatment algorithms, treatment pathways are really established through next generation sequencing. Think about the EGFR mutation in lung cancer, the BRCA mutation in prostate, or the KRAS in colorectal cancer. So these kind of few examples to mention where treatment decisions are based on next generation sequencing.
Right.
Okay, so Frank, tell us Further's role in this again.
Yeah, so once again, I think we've probably made our main incursion into the market over the years. Firstly, as having been a team, executive team that was originally in Best Doctors, second medical opinion company. So we have a strong understanding of how do you deliver services and concepts globally with a uniform, let's say, impact and result. We've gone on as an independent company after a management buyout to now develop insurance benefits that sit around that. So the idea is not only to be able to provide people access to services that will make a difference to the outcome of their illness, but that we essentially want to eliminate the financial barriers that are typically associated to that. And I think the very important piece here, when we talk about insurance and services, it's not just the ability to sort of say, okay, there are some financial guarantees behind this, or there are payment mechanisms. I think that we tend to find some of the biggest challenges that are faced with individuals that actually understanding what to do when the problem hits, the enormity of option, the challenge of navigation, and being able to arrive at someone like Dr. Arkanal at the quickest time possible to understand what needs to happen next. That, I think, is essentially our mission. That's what we do day in, day out, to be able to say that's our knowledge, our understanding, that when somebody finds themselves in a situation like having been diagnosed with cancer, that we're able to very, very quickly understand what needs to happen, what are the paths, how do we navigate that, and how do we concierge that so that they do as little as possible and we do literally pick up the burden and put all of that into action.
And I mean, the other comment on this is it's effectively, you're thinking, I guess, about how do you have broad reach around the world, around your networks. Effectively, you don't need this. Effectively, you need to have several, established centers where these kind of, same review molecular genetics tumor boards are happening. So you effectively have a broad reach, but it is these quick actioning on decision this way or that way, as in you get the right treatment or you not get the right treatment. That requires, a half an hour review of the genetic profiles, medical history, and there are only a few centers around the world providing this. And we, again, as I said, my practice, we see pretty much genetic tests from, Timbuktu to New York, and so around the world. We don't care where they come. We give only advice, obviously based on the right guidelines, but also in the context of what is needed in the clinical situation.
Okay, thank you very much. Anything else you wanted to add?
Not from my side.
Mike, you want to say some closing remarks? Do you want me to? Lynn? Jason?
Yeah, I sure will. I have something prepared here, Richard. Thank you. If you could just bear with me 1 second. And this, we can... Okay. Hopefully you're going to be editing that, Jason. Thanks. So, as mentioned, a fascinating topic and one that we expect will continue to positively impact individuals, families, and companies now and into the future. I want to thank Richard Pollack and special guest Frank Ahedo and Professor Arkanal. This now concludes this episode of Conversations with the Council. The American Benefit Council hosts a conversation with the Council to provide a forum for sharing information. The Council is a public policy organization committed to employer-provided benefits. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next on our next installment. This is Mike Mullins wishing you all an amazing day. Thank you.
Thank you.